A champagne fountain can drown out the click of a hammer being pulled back. Nobody who walked into the Meridian ever thought about that, least of all the men who came to launder their sins across green felt. But the woman counting their chips behind 3 inches of bulletproof glass thought about it constantly, and on the night the whole thing nearly came apart, she was the only person in the building who saw it coming. Her name was Cora Whitfield, and she had perfected the art of not being seen. It was a strange thing to be good at. Most people spent their lives clawing for attention. Cora spent hers dissolving into wallpaper. At 31, she was soft where Las Vegas demanded sharp, full-figured in a town that worshipped the lean and the lit. She wore plain black slacks and a plain white blouse, and she sat in the cage of the Meridian's private gaming floor, the back rooms, the ones without cameras the public ever saw, counting cash and chips for men who would have killed each other over a parking space. They looked at her the way you look at a vending machine, useful, forgettable, incapable of remembering your face, which was, of course, the most spectacular underestimation any of them ever made. The Meridian sat off the strip, behind a steakhouse, behind a velvet rope nobody crossed by accident. On paper, it belonged to a hospitality group with a name nobody could pronounce. In reality, it belonged to Salvatore Greco, and everyone who mattered knew it, and everyone who didn't was never coming back anyway. Greco ran the western half of an organization that stretched from the docks of Long Beach to the pawn shops of Reno, and he ran it the way a surgeon runs an operating theater. Quietly, precisely, with a stillness that made loud men nervous. People called him the Ghost, not because he was hard to find, but because by the time you understood he was in the room, it was already too late to leave it. Cora had worked the cage for 2 years. She had watched Greco maybe 40 times. She knew things about him no employee was supposed to know, not because anyone told her, but because nobody bothered to lower their voice around the heavy girl counting 20s. She knew he tipped the cocktail staff in $100 bills and never let anyone see him do it. She knew he'd quietly covered the hospital bill of a dealer whose kid got sick. She knew that when his men talked about people who'd crossed him, they got quiet and they looked at the floor. She also knew that he was going to die tonight, in about 11 minutes, if somebody didn't do something. It started the way these things always start, with a feeling she couldn't name yet. A wrongness in the pattern. Cora ran the back floor on patterns the way other people ran on caffeine. She knew which regulars came on, which nights, which security men stood where, which busboys lingered, and which ones hustled. The Meridian had a rhythm, and tonight the rhythm had a skip in it. It was a Thursday in February, slow rain hissing against the high windows nobody could see out of. A private game had been booked under a holding company, the kind of booking that meant Greco himself was coming. He arrived at 9:40, shrugging out of a charcoal overcoat into the hands of a host who looked like he might faint from the honor of it. Beside him walked a woman Cora had seen twice before, Vivian Marsh, tall, copper-haired, expensive in the way of someone who had married into money rather than earned it. She wore a deep green silk that moved like water and a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. That smile was the first wrong note. Cora watched her through the glass. Vivian hung on Greco's arm, laughed at the right moments, touched his sleeve with practiced affection. But her eyes kept moving. To the bar, to the service corridor, to the bank of private elevators in the back. Tap, 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 went her manicured nails against her own thigh, a nervous little drumbeat she didn't know she was playing. A woman in love with the most dangerous man in Nevada doesn't case the exits. A woman who knows she's about to need them does. Cora's stomach went cold. She slid 2 stacks of chips through the tray to a runner without looking, her eyes still on table 1. And she started counting the room the way she counted money, fast, quiet, automatic. The bar. 2 men she didn't recognize, and Cora recognized everyone. They wore good suits that fit badly across the shoulders, the way a suit fits when there's a holster underneath it. They had drinks in front of them they weren't drinking. They weren't watching the cards. They were watching Greco's reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bottles, the service corridor. The busboy, who usually loitered by the swinging doors, sneaking glances at his phone, was gone, just gone. His cart sat abandoned against the wall, and the man by the elevators. A lean figure in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, who had been standing there for 20 minutes without pushing a button, without leaving, without doing anything a man waiting for an elevator does. Cora knew that face. It had taken her a moment, but she had it now. She'd seen him 3 weeks ago, walking out of a meeting in the cigar lounge with a man she absolutely should not have seen him with, Anton Reyes. Greco's own consigliere, his right hand, the man who'd been at the ghost's side for 15 years. The pieces fell into place with a click that Cora felt in her teeth. The Meridian had 2 private elevators. One went up to the high roller suites. The other went down to a sub-basement and a steel door that opened onto the loading alley, and the only people who used it were Greco and his closest men, because it was the boss's clean exit, the one nobody else knew about. The man by the elevators wasn't waiting for a ride. He was guarding the boss's escape route, sealing it, so that when the shooting started and Greco ran for the one door he trusted, he'd find it locked and a gun waiting on the other side. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a beef that had spilled over. This was a clean, patient, beautifully constructed murder, planned by someone who knew exactly how Salvatore Greco moved when he was scared. Someone who'd stood beside him for 15 years and learned his every habit. And Vivienne Marsh, the lovely, devoted woman on his arm, was nothing but the timer on the bomb. She would excuse herself. She would get clear. And the moment she was behind a locked door, 3 men would converge on table 1 and put the ghost in the ground over a glass of bourbon. Cora looked at Salvatore Greco, sitting easy in his chair, swirling amber liquid in a heavy glass, laughing low at something the dealer said. He had no idea. The most feared man in the western half of the country was 11 minutes from death, and he was making small talk about the weather. She thought about all the reasons to do nothing. She was a cage clerk. She was nobody. If she was wrong, she'd humiliate herself and probably lose her job. If she was right, she would be putting herself directly in the path of men who killed for money, marking herself forever as a person who saw things and did something about them. The smart move, the safe move, the invisible move, the move she'd built her entire careful life around, was to keep her head down and count her chips and let the powerful people sort out their own bloody business. Then Vivienne Marsh stood up, smoothing the green silk over her hips, and leaned down to murmur something against Greco's ear, and pressed a kiss to his cheek, and started toward the back of the room, with a careful, casual walk. Cora made her decision somewhere in the space between 2 heartbeats. She wasn't going to watch a kind man die behind glass and do nothing. The cage had a procedure for everything except this. Cora's hands moved before her mind caught up. She tore a blank chit from the credit pad. Small, plain, the kind of paper that passed across her counter 100 times a night and meant nothing. She uncapped the cheap pen chained to the tray. Her fingers were shaking so badly, the first letter came out crooked, and she forced them still, pressing hard, writing in blocky capitals, because she didn't trust her cursive not to tremble into nonsense. Your right hand sold you out. Shooters at the bar. The basement elevator is a trap. She folded it once, twice, a third time, until it was smaller than a sugar packet, and she palmed it against her damp skin. Now came the impossible part. She had to get it to him. A cage clerk did not walk out onto the floor. It broke every rule the Meridian had, but there was one thread of routine she could pull, and she pulled it. Greco liked his bourbon poured a particular way, from a particular bottle, the floor kept in the cage safe because it cost more than most cars. When the boss ran low, the cage sent it out personally. Cora had done it twice before. She lifted the bottle from the safe, told the runner she'd handle it herself, buzzed open the cage door, and stepped out onto the floor on legs that did not feel like hers. The room had changed. She felt it the instant she crossed the threshold. The air had gone tight, charged, like the held breath before a thunderclap. The two men at the bar had set down their drinks. One of them had turned slightly on his stool, his hand drifting toward his jacket. The man by the elevators had pushed off the wall. Vivian was 3 steps from the restroom door. Cora walked toward table 1 with the bourbon held in both hands like an offering. And she did the only thing her body could do well, which was move slowly and seem like nothing. Her wide frame slid into the sight line between the bar and the boss, blocking it for 1 full second. And she felt rather than saw the shooters lose their angle. "Mr. Greco," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Compliments of the house. Your reserve." Salvatore Greco glanced up. For a fraction of a second his dark eyes flicked over her, the heavy woman from the cage, out of place, holding his bottle, and a flicker of mild confusion crossed his face. Cora set the bottle down, and as she reached to nudge his glass forward with 2 fingers, she slid the folded chit beneath the base of it, pressing it flush against the felt where his own hand would find it. She did not smile. She had spent 2 years smiling, the small, soft, harmless smile of a woman who wanted nothing. She did not wear it now. She held his eyes, and she let him see her, wide and urgent and deadly serious, and she gave 1 slow, heavy nod. Then she turned her broad back on the most dangerous man in Nevada and walked away, hips swaying with a casualness she dragged up from somewhere she didn't know she had. She did not look back until she was behind the glass again. Her pulse was a fist against her throat. Salvatore Greco had survived 20 years in a business where men were lucky to see 40. He did not gasp. He did not look over his shoulder. He reached for his glass with the easy boredom of a man reaching for his glass, took a slow swallow, and as he set it down, his thumb caught the folded paper and swept it into his palm. He let his hand fall beneath the lip of the table, and under cover of the linen runner, he unfolded it. Cora counted in her head. 1, 2, 3. She saw the exact moment it landed. It was nothing, a tightening at the corner of his jaw, a stillness coming over his shoulders that had not been there a second before. The boredom drained out of him and something else flowed in, cold and ancient. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for his phone. He thumbed out a message, his face a mask of pleasant nothing, and across the room the man by the elevators got a text, frowned at it, and the busboy who had vanished suddenly reappeared in the service corridor, looking confused, because Greco had just summoned 2 of his own men into position without a single soul understanding what was happening. Vivian came back from the restroom wearing a fresh coat of lipstick and a smile like a struck match. She slid into her chair, reached for her wine. "Sorry, darling," she breathed. "My clasp caught." Greco looked at her. It was a look with nothing behind it at all, a look like the open mouth of a well. "Is that so?" he said softly. She drank. Her hand was unsteady and the wine trembled against the rim. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Just admiring you." His voice was velvet, laid over a blade. "You know, I was thinking about your sister. Renata, how's she managing with all that trouble she's in?" The color went out of Vivian's face like water out of a cracked glass. "Renata's fine," she said. "Why? Because?" Greco leaned in, lacing his fingers together. "I hear she got herself in deep with some people up north. People who don't forgive a debt. Unless, of course, somebody offered them something worth more than money to settle it." Vivian's breath snagged. Her eyes flicked. One helpless, doomed instant toward the man at the bar. That was all the ghost needed. What happened next took less time than it takes to read about it. Greco's left hand shot across the table and closed around the front of Vivian's gown, and he hauled her toward him and over the table, just as the man at the bar came off his stool with a suppressed pistol rising. The first shot coughed through the room and shattered the bourbon bottle, exactly where Greco's chest had been a half second before. Cora flinched behind the glass, both hands flying to her mouth. "Down! Get down!" And it was Cora's own voice, ripping out of her at a volume that rattled the cage, because she could not stop it, because the only weapon she had was noise, and she threw all of it. The floor dissolved into screaming. Greco hurled Vivian backward into the path of the two men charging from the bar, and they went down in a tangle of silk and limbs. In the same motion, he came up out of his chair with a compact pistol that had been somewhere on his body the whole time, and he did not fire wild. Crack! Crack! The shooters folded, a knee, a shoulder, dropped, and shrieking, the surgeon taking them apart joint by joint. The man from the elevators rushed him, and Greco turned into it, took the man's wrist, and broke the gun out of his hand with a snap that carried over the chaos, then put him on the floor with a strike to the back of the leg. Then it was over. 15 seconds, maybe less. The meridian rang with whimpering and broken glass, and the high electric hum of terror. Vivian Marsh huddled on the carpet in her ruined green dress, mascara running in 2 black rivers, and Salvatore Greco stood over her in the wreckage, with his chest barely moving. "You should have let Renata drown," he told her. There was no anger in it. That was the worst part. There was nothing in it at all. Then he turned, slow, and his eyes swept the cowering room, the diners under the tables, the staff pressed to the walls, until they found the cage, and the heavy woman behind the glass with both hands still over her mouth. For a long moment, Salvatore Greco simply looked at her. Then he lifted 2 fingers to his temple and tipped them toward her, the smallest salute. "I owe you my life." And as the first far-off wail of sirens curled in off the rain-wet street, Cora Whitfield understood, with a sinking and exhilarating certainty, that slipping that note had not only saved a crime lord, it had dragged her, completely and forever, out of the wallpaper and into his world. The cleanup was a thing of terrible beauty. By the time the first squad car nosed into the alley, Greco's people had already washed the floor. Men in good suits moved through the wreckage with quiet purpose, collecting brass, pocketing weapons, walking a sobbing Vivian out through a side door before any badge laid eyes on her. The official story arrived before the detectives did, delivered by lawyers who'd clearly been on standby. An attempted armed robbery, brave private security, regrettable but lawful self-defense. When a tired detective named Okafor finally swept his flashlight into the cage and asked Cora what she'd seen, she gave him exactly the woman he expected. I don't know, she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself, letting her voice wobble. I heard pops. I dropped to the floor behind the counter. I prayed. That's all. I'm sorry, I'm not good at this. He didn't even finish writing it down. To him, she was one more shaken civilian, an overweight cage clerk with nothing useful between her ears. He patted the glass and moved on. For 3 days, Cora's life pretended to be normal. The Meridian closed for renovations. She sat in her 1-bedroom apartment off Maryland Parkway and jumped at every footstep in the hall, certain that any minute men with quiet guns would come to tie off the one loose thread who'd seen everything. People like her did not interfere in things like this and live to tell it. On the 4th night, the rain came back, hard and sideways, and a black SUV with windows like black mirrors slid up to the curb as she walked home from the corner store with a bag of groceries against her chest. The back door opened. A man got out under a wide umbrella. Bespoke suit, calm eyes, the bearing of someone who'd never lost a fight he chose. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said with no threat in it at all. "Mr. Greco would like a word. He'd like to thank you. It would be very much in your interest to get in." She got in. They drove an hour into the foothills, past the lights, up a private road, to a low stone house pressed against the dark shoulder of the mountains, all glass on one side, looking down over the whole electric sprawl of the valley. They led her down a hall hung with paintings that belonged in museums, to a study that smelled of leather and old books and bourbon. A fire was going, and by the tall windows, looking out at the storm-lit city, stood the ghost himself, in a plain black sweater, looking less like a killer and more like a man who hadn't slept in years. He turned. His dark eyes found her, and for the first time in her whole careful life, Cora Whitfield did not feel invisible. She felt seen down to the bone, and it was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to her. "Cora," Greco said. He poured 2 glasses of amber from a heavy decanter. "Do you drink? Only when I'm fairly sure I'm about to die." The corner of his mouth moved, a real one, brief and surprised. He crossed the room and put a glass in her hand. "You're not in danger here. You have my word." He leaned against the edge of a wide desk and studied her with a focus that made her want to look away and made it impossible to. "I had you looked into, Cora Whitfield. 31. A degree in forensic accounting you've never once used. 10 years moving money for other people's businesses, always in the back, always quiet. You could be running a department somewhere. Instead, you count chips in a cage. Why is that?" "I like quiet," she said. "Quiet's safe. Quiet saved my life." His voice dropped, all the warmth gone out of it, replaced by something deadly serious. "That note. You made Reyes at the elevators. You made the 2 at the bar. But you made Vivienne first, before any of it, just from the way her hands moved. My own security walked that floor for an hour and saw nothing. The men I pay a fortune to keep me breathing were blind, and a woman pouring my bourbon saw the whole architecture of my murder. People talk in front of the help," Cora said quietly. She found, to her own astonishment, that her chin had come up, and they talk in front of me twice as much. Because I'm big, I'm plain, I don't fit anybody's idea of a threat. So they get careless. They forget I have ears. They forget I can count. Greco stepped closer. He did not look at her with pity, which she had braced for, and he did not look at her with the polite, distaste-rich men usually saved for her, which she had also braced for. He looked at her with something that stopped the breath in her chest. He looked at her like she was the most remarkable thing he'd seen in 20 years. "You took the thing they used to dismiss you," he said low, "and you made it a weapon. That is the smartest damned thing I have ever heard in my life." He set down his glass. "Why did you do it, Cora? You could have ducked behind that counter and let me die, and nobody would ever have known." "So why?" The truth came out of her before she could dress it up. "Because you say thank you," she said, "when the cocktail girls bring your drinks. When the cage sends out your bottle. You always say thank you, and you never make a show of it. You paid for Marisol's boy when he was in the hospital, and you made the floor manager swear not to tell anybody it was you. You're a criminal, Mr. Greco. I'm not stupid, I know what you are. But you're not cruel, and I wasn't going to stand behind glass and watch a woman get you killed to bail out her sister." The fire popped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "You're finished in that cage," Greco said at last. He went around the desk, opened a drawer, wrote on a check, and slid it across the polished wood. Cora looked down. It was $250,000. "That's a signing bonus." He set a pen beside it. "I'm offering you a position. $500,000 a year. I don't want you to carry a gun. I don't want you near the money. God knows you'd hide it better than my accountants do. I want you in the room. My meetings, my dinners, my sit-downs with men who smile at me while they plan my funeral. I want you to sit in the corner and watch, and afterward I want you to tell me who lied, who's afraid, who's going to be the next Reyes." He leaned on his knuckles, and his eyes burned into hers. "Be my eyes, Cora. There isn't a man alive I trust to do what you did, blind, in 15 seconds, with nothing but a bottle of bourbon." Cora looked at the check. Then she looked up at the king of the Western underworld, and she picked up the pen and she signed. "When do I start?" she said. The next 6 months rearranged the order of things in ways nobody saw coming. Cora became Greco's shadow. On paper, she was a senior consultant for the hospitality group with the unpronounceable name. In practice, she was the deadliest thing he owned, and the men around him learned it the hard way. At first, the capos smirked behind their hands at the heavy, plain woman who followed the boss into every room and never said a word. The smirking stopped in March when she sat silent through a meeting with a city councilman, and afterward told Greco the man was sweating in a cold room and couldn't hold his hands still. Wired, she said, or terrified, or both. Greco held off on the payment he'd been about to make. 2 days later, the councilman was indicted. He'd been recording every word. It stopped completely in April, when she watched a longtime associate mirror the posture of a rival across a charity dinner. Leaning when he leaned, drinking when he drank, the unconscious choreography of a man who'd already changed sides. She went into the books with her unused accounting degree and her merciless eye, and pulled a thread that unraveled $2 million routed into accounts that should not have existed, and with every catch, something in Cora bloomed. She did not get smaller. She stopped apologizing for being large. She stopped folding herself into corners. Greco brought in tailors, who built clothes around her instead of trying to hide her, suits and gowns that made her a force walking into a room rather than a woman, hoping not to be noticed in it. She learned to take up space on purpose. She learned that the eyes she'd spent her whole life avoiding could be met and held and made to look away first. But the deepest change was the one neither of them said out loud for a long time. It happened in the long nights. The strategy sessions that ran past 2 in the morning, take-out cartons, and an expensive bottle between them, the city glittering far below the glass. Greco found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul, about his father, about the choices that had made him, about the loneliness that came standard with a throne. He found that her mind delighted him, that her humor was dry and quick and aimed itself fearlessly at him, that her loyalty was a thing he could lean his whole weight against. For the first time since he was a boy, Salvatore Greco felt completely safe in a room with another person. One night they were bent over a shipping manifest, and Cora reached for a folder, and her hand brushed his. He caught it, his fingers closed warm around hers, and she went still. "Salvatore," she said, and it came out unsteady. He stood and drew her gently to her feet and looked at her with a heat that buckled her knees. "You spend every hour reading everyone in the room, Cora," he said, his free hand rising to cup her face. "Have you ever once read how I look at you? I assumed," she managed, "that you valued my judgment. I value your life." His thumb moved along her cheek. "I value the most extraordinary mind I have ever known, and I have been undone by you since the night you walked out of that cage with my bourbon and the nerve of 10 men. Salvatore, I'm not." She started, on pure reflex, to make herself smaller, to say the thing she'd been saying her whole life. "Don't." It came out rough and low. "Don't you dare insult the woman I love." The words landed in her like a blow she hadn't braced for. Before she could find the breath to answer, he kissed her, not gentle, not careful, but certain, the kiss of a man done waiting, and she rose into it, her arms going around his shoulders, finally, after 31 years, stepping all the way out of the dark and letting herself be seen. They kept it quiet, the two of them, until the Continental Foundation Gala in the fall. It was the night of the year, the one event where the city's clean money and its dirty money breathed the same air under the same chandeliers, and by some private joke that only Greco could have arranged, it was being held in the newly remodeled ballroom of the Meridian, the very floor where Cora had once counted chips behind glass, where a woman in green silk had nearly handed Salvatore Greco to his murderers. The room was thick with billionaires and senators and men who killed for a living. When the tall doors swung open and the ghost walked in, a hush rolled across the floor, like a tide pulling back. He was not alone, and he was not with some glittering ornament on his arm. He was with Cora. She came in on a custom sapphire blue gown that fell over her like water over stone, off the shoulder, unapologetic about every curve it covered. Diamonds caught fire at her throat under the chandeliers. Her hair was swept into dark vintage waves, and her eyes were lined sharp and her chin was up, and she was by any honest measure magnificent. The whispers caught and spread like a struck match in dry grass, because they knew her. The bartenders knew her. The hosts knew her. The men in $5,000 suits who had looked straight through her for 2 years knew her. The heavy, invisible cage clerk, now on the arm of the most dangerous man west of the Rockies. A rival boss recovered himself enough to step forward, eyes wide, and dip his head. "Mr. Greco, and this must be your new partner." Greco did not merely nod. He pulled Cora in against his side and pressed a kiss to her temple in front of every powerful pair of eyes in the room, a public seal nobody could misread. "This is Cora," he said, and his voice carried without effort into every silent corner of the ballroom. "She is the only reason I am standing here breathing, and the next man who looks through her the way you all once did will be the last thing he ever fails to see." Cora looked out over the sea of stunned, careful, respectful faces, the same faces that had counted her as furniture, as a vending machine, as nothing, and felt no fear at all. The invisible woman was gone. In the place where she had stood, behind glass, counting other people's money and praying not to be noticed, there was now a queen, and the whole room had learned her name in a single night.